Thanks, you guys, for being here. If anybody would have suggested 15 years ago that I would be here talking about a new food system, I would have said they were nuts. I was a financial analyst on a team of all guys. I was the only woman on the team, and they said, "You're going to cover the food industry." What they didn't know was that I couldn't cook. I burnt noodles. I really wasn't very interested in covering the food industry, but I was a new guy on the totem pole, and so I did. And I quickly fell in love with the job. It was fascinating to learn the models, to learn how they were designing the system. So for me to be here today, I am such an unlikely crusader. It's a job that I loved, and it's one that I always thought I would go back to after we had had our kids. But 8 years ago, everything changed when our youngest child had an allergic reaction over breakfast. And that morning, as her face was swelling shut, everything I had ever done, business school on a full scholarship, graduating the top of my class, it didn't matter. I didn't know what to do. And I raced her to the pediatrician's office. And she starts rattling off these statistics about food allergies, how from 1997 to 2002, there had been a doubling of the peanut allergy. And she started asking me what I'd fed the kids for breakfast, and that morning it had been tubes of blue yogurt, Lego My Eggo waffles, and scrambled eggs. And as I was listening to her talk about food allergies, all I could think was, since when? Since when had so many little kids become so allergic? And that day, a question entered my mind that still has not been answered. Are we allergic to food, or what's been done to it? From 1997 until 2007, there was a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions. The National Association of School Nurses now says that 19% of school kids have a food allergy. It wasn't like that when we were kids. We all had PB&Js and cartons of milk. Those weren't loaded weapons on a lunchroom table. And it begged the question, what has changed? And as I was reading labels, I was forced to read those labels. I didn't want to read those labels. I couldn't cook. And I was reading these labels, and I was looking at all these ingredients, and I knew exactly why we'd put them in there. I'd studied it as an analyst. You swap out the real stuff, you put the fake stuff in, it drives profitability, it preserves shelf life. I got it. But the question I had never asked as an analyst was, how much of this stuff is safe? And what's it doing to our kids? And as I started looking at the health of this generation of children, it was absolutely stunning. 1 out of 3 kids has allergies, autism, ADHD, or asthma. 1 in 68 kids today now has autism, a 30% increase in the last 2 years. And 1 in 13 now has food allergies. According to the CDC, cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in American children under the age of 15. And all I could think was, I have 4 kids. What are my odds? And I couldn't unlearn that, and I was trying to figure out what I could do to protect my children. And in the fall of 2006, as I was literally doing everything I could to learn about food allergies, a headline came across my screen: "Are genetically engineered foods triggering allergic reactions?" I had no idea what a genetically engineered food was. We'd had 4 kids in 5 years. I hadn't been paying attention to the food. And so I did a deep dive into these genetically engineered ingredients, and I learned, after learning about the rates of cancer in children, the rates of cancer in adults, how 1 in 2 men are expected to get cancer and 1 in 3 women, that the President's Cancer Panel was telling us 41% of us are expected to get cancer in our lifetime. That in 1996, we introduced these new ingredients into our food. And they weren't labeled, these genetically engineered ingredients. They had never existed in the food supply before. And I went totally analytical on it. I saw the business model right away. You genetically engineer these new ingredients, you put them into the seed, it enables you to routinely spray these seeds with chemicals and weed killers to drive profitability. And it made a lot of sense. There were 2 kinds at that point in time. One was genetically engineered to withstand increasing doses of these chemicals. The other was genetically engineered to produce its own insecticide internally in the plant. That one was so new. And because the plant produced that insecticide internally, those foods were now regulated by the EPA as a pesticide. And I thought, why weren't we told this? This is a fundamental change. It's patented by the US Patent and Trademark Office. It's regulated by the EPA as a pesticide. How can they tell us this is the same? And as I looked at the business model, sure enough, it drove the sale of the chemicals being applied to the crops. That red line is 1996 when the products were introduced. The massive increase in the first 13 years was 527 million pounds of chemical applications going onto our food. And as a mom, all I could think was, why weren't we told this? 60% of the world's population was told this. The long-term human health studies didn't exist, and they exercised that level of precaution, and we hadn't been told. And as I thought about it, I thought, is it a food system, or is this a chemical system? Because when I had been an analyst that covered the food industry, never once did we meet with these chemical companies making our food. I also knew as an analyst that correlation was not causation, and just because we had a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions, that did not mean that just because we were inserting all these new things into our food, that that's what we were reacting to. But the correlation was so strong that it merited investigation. And it was one of the reasons that countries around the world exercised that level of precaution, because they were concerned about the allergenicity of these foods. And so I thought, what's going on in these other countries where they either didn't allow these ingredients or where they labeled them? And one of the first things I learned absolutely fundamentally changed how I viewed things. Here in the United States, our American companies had introduced all of these ingredients, artificial dyes, artificial growth hormones, genetically engineered ingredients. They had put all this stuff into our food, and I got it as an analyst. It drives profitability. At the same time, our own American corporations were formulating their products differently for eaters in other countries without them. And I thought, why have they placed a different value on the lives of Americans? If they're using all of these artificial ingredients here, and they're using real ones in other countries, we're not asking them to reinvent the wheel. We're simply asking for those same products for our families too. And when I said that, the food industry kind of had an allergic reaction to me. I got called a lot of names. This was one of the nice ones. But I couldn't unlearn what I had learned. And I moved on the faith that these conditions were affecting all of our families. 1 in 3 kids now has autism, allergies, ADHD, or asthma. Cancer doesn't care where we work. The President's Cancer Panel says 41% of us are expected to get cancer. And as I thought about the impact that was having on our economy, I realized, again, government source data, the United States spends 2.5 times more on healthcare and disease management on average than any other country. 18 cents of every dollar that we spend in this economy is spent on healthcare and managing disease. According to CNN and Time, if you have a little one with food allergies, that's an extra $4,200 a year. I turned to the CIA. I wanted to see how we stacked up life expectancy at birth. Again, it was a comparative analysis, what we had done versus countries around the world. And this fiercely patriotic American in me wanted to see us at the top of the list. And as I started scrolling down that list, we're at 42, just ahead of countries like Bahrain. And I thought, we're so much better than this. We need a new prototype. And suddenly I had to rethink organic. You know, here was this adjective, organic. It is so loaded. I didn't want to spend the money on that food. And as I started to truly understand what was happening to the food supply, I realized that what organic actually meant was that it was produced without all of these ingredients. So what our grandparents had just called food, we had to give the adjective organic to. And here it was costing us all so much money, and that was because, as a big national family with our taxpayer resources, the monies that we were putting in were going towards growing the food with all these chemicals. while the farmers that were growing things without the chemicals were charged fees to prove that they were safe, and then fees to prove that they had to label them. And on top of that, organic was growing at 14% a year, and only 1% of our farmland was dedicated to organic farming. So that meant we were outsourcing any of the organic food that we did want to other countries like China. And I thought, we need to bring this home, support our own economy, support our own farmers, and build this better food system so that clean and safe food can be affordable to all Americans. Thankfully, venture capital firms, private equity firms have stepped up, and they've started investing in clean food, they've started investing in farmland. Wall Street went Annie's. They make mac and cheese without the junk. They did their IPO in March of 2012. It had the biggest opening day gain of any IPO in almost a year, which meant that of all the technology, all of it, that Wall Street saw that year, they got the most excited over a bowl of mac and cheese that didn't have any junk in it. It was obvious we needed a new operating system for all of us. This isn't lifestyle, the rich and famous. Clean and safe food should be affordable to all Americans. And thankfully, certain companies are hearing us, they recognize it, and they're listening. They know that none of us would have chosen these conditions. None of us would have chosen these conditions. Chipotle has started to dump the junk out of their food. Their share price is soaring. White Wave is another company. They recognize that as much as we all grew up on milk in our fridge, that's not the case anymore, so they've got all these different alternatives to milk. And Wall Street is responding. I think probably one of the most fascinating is to compare one of these chemical companies with a food company that's producing food without chemicals. And the one without chemicals is on top by a lot because they know that's where we're going. And they know that this is not a fad because cancer and autism and food allergies are not fads. So what do? This is all of us. The first thing we got to do is get these American companies to standardize. We're not asking them to reinvent the wheel. They already formulate it differently overseas. We just want those same things on our grocery store shelves for our families. And then each and every one of us, we can do one thing. You can do one thing. I have 4 kids, and I thought, I can't do everything. I'll do one thing. And that first thing was just to try to get these GMOs out, these genetically engineered ingredients. Maybe for another family, it's getting the artificial colors out. Just pick one thing. You can do one thing. And focus on progress, not perfection. Do not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And then you can create this incredible change. And probably most importantly is to find a friend. Because if you have a kid with autism, or a parent with cancer, or a little one with food allergies, it hurts the same way. And find somebody that feels that with you, who you can lean into, so that you can create the change together. Because none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. And as we invest in us, in our families, in our economy, we will create a better food system, one that meets the needs of the 21st century. And I truly believe that there is nothing more important that we could be doing. Thank you.